When the ANBERNIC RG405V was first revealed, a lot of people thought it looked a little bit ugly. It appeared to resemble a stretched out and bulkier version of the original Game Boy, and considering this is a variant of the rather sleek looking RG405M which released earlier in the year, I wouldn't be surprised if you immediately turned your nose up at this thing and walked away. However, I have to admit, I'm probably in a bit of a minority here, but I actually quite like the design of this. It might not be the most attractive handheld I've ever laid eyes on, but it seems like ANBERNIC have gone for practicality over visual appeal with this. My first thoughts on seeing the RG405V in person is that it's way bigger than it looks in pictures and videos. This thing is a chunky boy, but because of that, you've got a pretty impressive screen size, you've got great ergonomics with my hands fitting nicely around it without being too cramped, and because of these grips on the back, it feels even more comfortable than most other handheld emulators I've used in the past. We're off to a good start right out of the box, but let's dig a little bit deeper. How easy was this to set up, and what is the gameplay experience like? I've been dreaming of a device in this sort of price range that can play PS2 and GameCube games smoothly for a while now, and on paper it seems like this might just be able to do that. But that's enough about the theory of it all, let's get testing. Before we dive in, I want to mention that our first book, A Handheld History, is now available on Amazon and in retail stores. Like the RG405V, it's pretty thick, so if you enjoy wrapping your hands around big things, then this could be the book for you. It's full of photos, illustrations, and of course words about both retro and modern portable gaming. Definitely check it out if that sounds like your kind of thing. After all, it is getting close to Christmas. First off, let's talk specs. The ANBERNIC RG405V features a Unisoc Tiger T618 CPU, a Mali G52 GPU, and 4GB of RAM. It's equipped with a 4-inch screen with a 640x480 resolution, but it's also a touchscreen, which is particularly handy considering that this is an Android device, and having that input method makes this much easier to navigate. Hardware-wise, this is very comparable to something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. There's actually only a few small differences here, like the battery being bigger in the RG405V with it boasting 5500 mAh. It comes with Hall effect analog sticks, and of course, the screens are different, with the RG405V having a 4:3 aspect ratio, whereas the Pocket 3 Plus is widescreen and has a higher resolution. Overall though, they're pretty much on par with each other, so if you're already familiar with the Pocket 3 Plus, you know what you're getting into with this. It's just that you're getting that vertical Game Boy style form factor. Also, if you've got an ANBERNIC RG405M, the internals here are literally identical, it's just the orientation of the device being horizontal rather than vertical. This is the same device in a different shell effectively. Giving the device a closer look, we've got a D-pad on the top left which feels amazing. It's the standard NES style design and it feels quite snappy when you press a direction, which is great for some tactile feedback. It's never nice when you touch a D-pad and it's got that horrible mushy feeling to it, like you're pressing down on a raw baked bean or something. And I'm glad to say that that isn't the case here. In the middle we've got the home button which is embedded into the shell slightly to avoid accidental presses. On the right we've got action buttons in the Nintendo layout, and these are even coloured based on the SNES controller. We've got a lot of Nintendo influence here. The buttons themselves have a good amount of travel to them and feel very high quality. Below that we've got two Hall effect sticks that are clickable for L3 and R3 inputs. These are kinda similar in size to the Switch Joy-Con sticks, but I would actually say that these feel better than what's being offered by the Switch. They just feel a bit tighter, which is probably due to the Hall effect. At the very bottom we've got Start and Select, which feel quite premium, not moving too much in the shell and having the same high quality membranes that the action buttons have. ANBERNIC could have easily cut corners here, but this goes to show that they put a lot of care into building this. On the bottom, you've got the stereo speakers on the left and right with a headphone jack in the middle. On the left side of the device, you've got a micro SD card slot to expand the storage of the device, and this button that swaps from the stock front end to the Android interface. On the right side, you've got the volume buttons and the power button, which you press once to put the RG405V into sleep mode and hold to completely turn it off. On the top, you've just got a USB-C port, which is used for both charging and data transfer. Finally, on the back, we've got a fan to keep the device cool, something which a lot of handhelds around this price range don't have, and the shoulder and trigger buttons, which are in line rather than being stacked. Literally the only issue I have with the design of the RG405V in terms of the way it feels to hold and the way the inputs feel, is that the shoulder and trigger buttons aren't stacked. I feel like I complain about this a lot with loads of these devices, but it rarely does affect me because I always end up accidentally pressing the outside buttons when I'm only trying to press the inside ones, and it just feels like you have to stretch very slightly too far with your fingers to reach those inside buttons. Not only that, but an issue with this particular device are that these back buttons are extremely sensitive, and because you're always resting your fingers on them, you'll probably find yourself accidentally pressing them quite a lot. So far though, even with my little gripes about those back buttons, this is still an impressive device in terms of the build quality. It does cost $138 on the ANBERNIC website though, which isn't exactly cheap, so you would hope if you were paying that much money for a device like this, that it would be pretty easy to install games and actually get stuff running. So, let's take a look. My first impressions with actually playing a couple of games on this were a little bit mixed. It was running things fairly well straight out of the box, but I was constantly getting a little bit annoyed by the fact that I couldn't find a way to enter the emulation settings with certain systems in order to customize the graphics, hotkeys, and even access save states. The front end that the system comes preloaded with didn't seem to provide much in the way of customization either, and I was left a bit disappointed with my experience at first. Because this is an Android device though, you do have a lot of customization options if you back out of the front end and enter the standard Android interface. I decided to basically revert the device to its default state, removing all of the pre-installed emulators and essentially de-bloating the storage to start again and only install what I actually want, setting everything up from scratch exactly how I wanted it. I ended up following a guide from Joey's Retro Handhelds to assist with this, which helped quite a lot and was a very easy process. Interestingly, the RG405V features 128GB of internal storage, so unlike with a lot of other handhelds, I didn't actually need a micro SD card to install all of the ROMs I wanted. I just plugged it into a PC and drag and dropped everything into folders and then linked them to the individual emulators I'm using for each system. Is doing this 100% essential? Probably not, but I do feel like you'll get more enjoyment out of the device if you go down this route because you'll be able to basically customize each individual emulator yourself, as well as doing stuff like being able to set up your own custom hotkeys so you know what's going on with the device. You might also be able to get higher end games running a tad bit smoother because you're in control of the settings. For most lower end systems, I used RetroArch as the emulator and downloaded the specific cores I needed for each console. So NES, SNES, Atari 2600, Mega Drive, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, anything up to the 16-bit era basically, will run absolutely perfectly, which is to be expected. Moving up to the N64, I used MuPen64 as the emulator, the PS1 uses DuckStation, and Dreamcast uses Redream. And all of these using these emulators also ran absolutely flawlessly. PS1 and N64 games could even go to 2 times the native resolution to bring them up to 480p, which matches the maximum resolution of the screen. So you can definitely expect to get the most out of these games by using this device. For Nintendo DS emulation, I used Drastic, and this worked pretty well too. Although the dual screen element doesn't really translate the best to a single screen device like this, but that's going to be an issue with any emulator. For any game like Super Mario 64 DS that only really requires a single screen though, things work pretty great. It did have the occasional stutter here and there, but it's definitely still highly playable. Now we enter the real testing phase though. For PS2 games I used an emulator called Ether SX2, GameCube used Dolphin, PSP used PPSSPP, and 3DS used Citra. Now I've gotten very used to attempting to play PS2 games on devices like this and them being unplayable because the hardware just isn't quite powerful enough. However, it turns out that the RG405V is actually very capable in this area if you fiddle with a couple of settings in the emulator menu. The two settings I changed that gave me the best performance across most games were in the System sub-menu. I set the EE cycle rate to 50% and the EE cycle skip was set to normal. Some games ran better with this set to maximum underclock, but for the most part I was very impressed with the results. Even the slightly more demanding games like Ratchet & Clank shocked me at how playable they were. Sure, it is slowing down occasionally, but it never quite reaches the point where it becomes unplayable. For the ultimate test, I wanted to play a particularly demanding game, so I fired up Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence, and as to be expected, it didn't run all that well. Weirdly, the colours were slightly distorted, which caused this flickering effect, and it was also dropping frames like a madman, particularly in the bigger areas of the game. So I would say this can handle the lower and middle end games, but anything that really pushed the PS2 won't work very well here. Like the PS2, the GameCube is probably one of the consoles you're most interested in seeing in action. I couldn't quite get things running as smoothly as I could with the PS2, but I did manage to get certain games in a very playable state. Something which will improve your experience here is if you use PAL ROMs and play them in the 50Hz mode. By doing this, the game will only natively run at 50 frames a second rather than 60, which makes it easier to get consistent frame rates on the device without it chugging as much. As you can see, I'm playing Mario Kart Double Dash here, and it's running very well. It's not flawless, but it's highly playable and you could definitely get invested in playing it like this. Super Monkey Ball actually ran pretty well even at 60 frames a second, so if a game isn't quite as demanding, you can actually get good results here. Again, anything too demanding will struggle though. Super Mario Sunshine rarely chugged because of how big the levels are and how much is happening on screen at once. Another thing is that because the RG405V doesn't feature analog triggers, certain mechanics won't work properly. In Mario Sunshine, you're supposed to be able to move around and use FLUDD at the same time by only partially holding down the trigger. Holding it down all of the way makes Mario stand still and enter a sort of aiming mode. With the RG405V though, you're only able to do that full button press or not press it at all, which locks you into only having the aiming mode. So if you're looking for a portable way of running around and squirting water at the same time, then this isn't the device for you. The bigger issue really though is that the RG405V struggles to run those high-end GameCube games at all, regardless of the triggers. So now moving on to the PSP, something that you've got to bear in mind is that this device isn't actually that suited to playing these games, considering that we're dealing with a 4:3 screen, meaning that every game on this system is going to be letterboxed, because the PSP had a 16:9 aspect ratio. However, if you can get over that, then this is extremely good for PSP emulation. Everything I tested ran perfectly, looked great, and because you don't need the L2 or R2 buttons, it didn't feel awkward to control anything either. As for 3DS emulation, from my experience here, this is wildly inconsistent. I played Super Mario 3D Land and it ran terribly, constantly dropping frames to the point where it was unplayable. However, I then tried Mario Kart 7 and it ran extremely well. I would go as far as to say that this is a legitimate way of playing the game. So then I tried another game with Metroid Samus Returns, and this was somewhere in the middle, dropping frames quite a lot but just barely being playable. So I would probably go into this thinking that it can't run 3DS games properly, and then it'll be a pleasant surprise if something does happen to run. Again, another thing to keep in mind is that like with the PSP, 3DS games run in widescreen, so you'll have these games playing letterboxed. And another thing is that because of the dual screen nature of the 3DS, it also makes certain games feel a bit janky with you having to swap between the screens or just play with both screens on the very small display at the same time. Although this isn't ideal, we do have a touchscreen here, so it's not impossible to play games like this. Overall, I'm actually really impressed with the results here. I didn't expect to be able to get PS2 games like Ratchet & Clank running at anywhere near an acceptable speed, so the device has definitely exceeded my expectations. Now I'm going to be upfront and I'll admit that I haven't actually personally tried out that many powerful handheld emulators, so my opinion here might not mean all that much to you, but I'm going to go ahead and say that I think this is the best handheld emulator I've ever used. It's comfortable to hold, the screen is crystal clear with amazing viewing angles thanks to the IPS display, the battery life is amazingly impressive. I mean, I was getting some bonkers hours out of this with a full charge lasting between 6 to 7 hours depending on what I was playing, but the most important thing is that the power offered by the hardware in this device allows it to play a good amount of PS2 and GameCube games at very good speeds. Because this is an Android device, you also have access to Google Play Store games and apps, adding in even more value. I tested a bit of Call of Duty Mobile and it ran perfectly, although you do have to bear in mind that this is a 4x3 screen, so it might not be the best device for this type of thing. Plus, I couldn't seem to get it working with the physical inputs on the device, despite the game having controller support, but I would imagine that with some tinkering around you could get this working. Admittedly, Android gaming isn't an area that I'm particularly experienced with, but it's still nice to have the option to do this. For $138, I feel like this is a no-brainer for anybody interested in handhelds. Considering that the last handheld I reviewed was the Powkiddy RGB10 Max III Pro and it cost $115 and that's with no micro SD card, and this device didn't stand a chance of playing PS2 games, didn't have Wi-Fi, didn't have a touchscreen, didn't run on Android, and just lacked the overall premium finish of the RG405V, you're much better off paying that extra $20 or so and getting way more value for your money. From what I've experienced from devices at around this price range, this blows pretty much everything else out of the water. But I think that about wraps things up. I'm actually really impressed with this. If it had stacked trigger buttons that were maybe a little bit less sensitive and had a little bit more power to be able to run those GameCube and PS2 games that tad bit smoother, this would be perfect. Even as things stand though, I can highly recommend this to basically anybody, regardless of if you've got a million other handhelds or if you're a handheld novice. But let me know what you think. Are you impressed with the results in this video? Is it made you want to go out and get one? Or do you already have one? And if so, what do you think to it? As always, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more retro content coming soon, remember to check out a Handheld History, now available on Amazon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.